Hey, and welcome, gurus, to this lesson, Azure Firewall Concepts. I'm Chase, one of your Azure training architects here at A Cloud Guru, a Pluralsight company. And it's in this lesson where we're going to be describing what Azure Firewalls are so that we can get a foundational understanding of them as we move through this section. Then we're going to discuss standard and premium SKUs of Azure Firewall so that we understand the differences between these two SKUs and the features that they offer. We'll then discuss classical firewall implementations versus the modern Azure Firewall Manager implementations of Azure Firewall. And then we'll round out this lesson with some key takeaways. So without further ado, let's get started. Azure Firewall is our firewall as a service solution that is designed for filtering layer 3 through layer 7 traffic, and it is a stateful firewall that we have inside of Azure, meaning that if traffic is allowed inbound or outbound, the return traffic is also allowed, as well as if traffic is ever allowed because a rule exists, as long as that traffic establishes and keeps that connection that it started, even if we were to create a rule that would then deny that traffic, if that original connection is still established, it will not just go away. We'd have to close that connection, and then we would see that the traffic would no longer be allowed inbound or outbound, and that's the stateful nature of Azure Firewall. Now, with Azure Firewall, it's cloud native, and what that means is that we're using this inside of Azure. What we do is deploy a purpose-built Azure Firewall subnet with an Azure Firewall resource inside of it. And much like any firewall, what we intend to do is protect traffic for our resources from places like the internet and other networks, be that on premises or in other cloud providers. Now, while we create our Azure firewalls and deploy them into a purpose-built Azure Firewall subnet inside of a virtual network in a specific region, we can filter traffic from other regions to this firewall for peered networks, hybrid networks, on-premise, as well as in other cloud providers. But for the best performance, we create a firewall per region. Now, with Azure Firewall, we have support for things that we're familiar with firewall, such as DNAT, network rules, and application rules. We also have integration with Azure Monitor, and we have threat intelligence features inside of our Azure Firewall. Our Azure Firewalls being deployed in an Azure Firewall subnet provides us high availability via auto-scaling of those resources that are running in the background for this firewall. And we also have the ability to deploy our firewalls into multi-AZ deployment models. And with Azure Firewall, we have capabilities such as force tunneling. We have support for FQDN and FQDN tags, custom DNS and DNS proxy. We also have support for IP groups, which are collections of IPs that we create, which are similar to service tags, which are also supported on Azure Firewalls. If you remember service tags from the NSG section of this course, those are those collection of IP addresses that Microsoft has taken the initiative on creating for us already. We also have support with something known as web categories and URL filtering, which we'll get into more in just a moment. Now, really quickly, I just wanted to provide an example of what it is exactly that we're trying to do with our Azure Firewalls. The name of the game here is network security, and we're not just talking about network security for the virtual network where our firewall resource exists. We're talking about providing network security to other networks, be those on-premise in other cloud providers or even other networks inside of Azure. And we can set this up in such a way that we have a hub and spoke design so that all traffic that we desire to is going through our firewall, providing us that filtering and that network security. And this is possible, again, in a hub and spoke through having peered networks with a hub network where our Azure Firewall resource exists. Now, how we're able to route traffic towards the firewall is actually via routes. These routes are our pathways for traffic, and we can establish a route table resource that has a route with the next hop of our Azure Firewall. And this might look like a user-defined route that says that all traffic destined for 0.0.0/0 will have the next hop of our Azure Firewall. And we'll represent our Azure Firewall in that next hop of a network virtual appliance using the private IP address of our Azure Firewall. And once we have that route on that route table, we can associate that route table with a particular subnet so that we can route all that traffic from that subnet through our Azure Firewall, providing that network security and filtering by sending the traffic through the firewall first before it heads outbound to the internet or to another network. Now that we have a good conceptual understanding of how Azure Firewall works, let's actually talk about the different SKUs that we have for Azure Firewall. We have Standard and Premium, and each of these provides different functionality for our Azure Firewall. The Standard provides us DNAT, network, and application rules. It also provides threat intelligence and the capabilities for Azure Monitor integration to monitor our Azure Firewall resources. It also provides FQDN support for fully qualified domain names. And it has built-in high availability using the virtual machine scale sets that are actually running our firewall in the background that we don't see. Now, with Premium, what we get is all of those standard features we just discussed, plus we get intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems. We have TLS inspection, so that we can perform things like TLS termination. We have web categories, and these are things like e-commerce or sports or search engines that we can use. And we also have URL filtering, which we'll see more of later so that we can better understand that concept. Now, when it comes down to choosing between these two, the main driving factor is pricing. And we're charged per deployment hour of our firewall, and we're also charged for data processed by the firewall. Now that we've got that covered, let's jump into diving a little bit deeper on some of those premium features that we need to explain. As we discussed with Azure Firewall of a premium SKU, we have intrusion detection and prevention systems. So what we can do is have built-in automated inspecting to detect problems or prevent those problems from happening as far as intrusion into our networks. Then we also have the TLS inspection, and this typically looks like the keys that we have to decrypt and encrypt traffic between the client and the server. But when we implement this in Azure Firewall, what we do is we provide these keys so that Azure Firewall can actually decrypt and inspect this traffic, and this is known as TLS termination. We're terminating the encrypted traffic to inspect it, and then we re-encrypt it and send it on its way to where it needs to go. Now, the other thing that we wanted to cover was the URL filtering. We have our FQDNs, such as pluralsight.com. This is a fully qualified domain name. And whenever we go to websites, they have different URLs, right? These uniform resources that are running in the background, such as this course and other courses you might find on the platform. We can filter down to these specific URLs inside of our rules. We also have something with our premium SKU Azure Firewalls known as web categories. And this takes the FQDNs a little bit further by grouping them into common categories such as search engines, or even introducing some of that URL filtering into those web categories for things like gaming, so that we can say, yes, google.com is a search engine if you're just going to google.com, but if you're going to google.com/games, well, that would fit into the gaming web category. Now that we understand some of those premium features, let's talk about the different ways that we can manage our Azure Firewall. Now, the initial rendition of Azure Firewall, now known as Classic Azure Firewall, used a classic rule management style of actually managing those rules on the firewall resource. So we would go to the firewall resource to manage those rules. And if we had another firewall resource in another region, we would manage those rules on that firewall resource independently from one another. So we have to make sure that if we want rules to exist on both firewalls that are the same, we have to actually then clone those rules over. We're not managing them as a separate entity, but rather on the firewalls independently. Now, with the new deployment method of Azure Firewall, using Azure Firewall Manager, we have this global resource that allows us to manage our firewalls centrally for all the firewalls that we may have. And we use something known as policy-based rule management, where we create a firewall policy resource that includes all the rules that we want to use. And this is abstracted away from our Azure firewalls, providing us the capabilities to actually associate those policies with one or more firewalls. And this provides us a way of centrally managing policies and firewall resources across regions via Azure Firewall Manager. All right, gurus, now it's time to wrap up this lesson with the key takeaways for Azure Firewall to move us into the next lessons. So It's important to remember, if you take away anything about Azure Firewall, that it's a firewall as a service solution for filtering layer 3 through 7 traffic for virtual networks and hybrid networks in hub and spoke topologies. We also have standard and premium SKUs of Azure Firewall providing us different features. And the big differences between these SKUs are Azure Firewall Premium provides features for intrusion detection prevention systems, as well as TLS inspection to provide that TLS termination so we can encrypt and decrypt traffic and allow us to inspect that unencrypted traffic and send it on to its destination. We also have the URL filtering and the web categories that we talked about, and they provide us additional features for creating robust rules. And then Azure Firewall, we also have to remember, has multiple deployment methods. We have the Azure Firewall rule management option of classical rules, as well as the policy-based rules that allow us to centrally manage multiple Azure firewalls and Azure Firewall policies for our rule management scheme. And Azure Firewall Manager acts as the management plane for those centrally managed firewalls from that Azure Firewall Global resource. All right, gurus, that is all of my time for now. Thanks so much for joining me in this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the lessons to come where we talk more about Azure Firewall.